It seemed subtle at first. A subtle rustling sound, as if someone were talking just out of earshot. My parents had made an impetuous auction purchase of our old Victorian home at 12 Oakhaven Lane in Asheville, North Carolina, and I would sit in my bed, tilting my head, attempting to identify the source. A simple case of the old home settling, Mom would dismissively wave it off. However, the home was refusing to settle. There was speech. In the weeks that followed, the murmurs became increasingly audible. Pieces of speech, too disjointed to make sense of. Key must be hidden. It would sound like never tell secret. There was an underlying cold of anxiety, and it was constantly whispered and urgent. I attempted to find an explanation. Calm down, I reminded myself. Too little sleep. The drafty windows and squeaky pipes of a home that is almost a century old are fooling me. However, a knot of uneasiness knotted itself into my gut. As I sat on the second floor of my room one evening doing my schoolwork, I could make out a very audible mumble that went something like, basement.behind.loose. Rick. I felt my heart racing. Down in the basement. Down there, we seldom ever ventured. Cobwebs, dampness, mustiness, and sheets covering abandoned furniture filled the air. I shuddered at the idea of going down there by myself. Concerned about the rumblings, I informed my folks. As a practical engineer, Dad scoffed. Hallucinations, he said, as expected in a historic home. But Mom didn't seem quite as persuaded. She had a natural sensitivity to everything, strange events. Spirits, she referred to them. Perhaps we ought to investigate the basement simply in case, she said to Dad. He agreed, more to make her happy than because he really cared, but he still rolled his eyes. We went down into the basement the next day, equipped with a crowbar and a flashlight. The stench of dust and mildew was pervasive. There was an ever-present hum all about us, and the whispers seemed stronger. Down here, seeking the slack brick, we followed the hushed directions. After what seemed like an eternity, Dad finally located it. Hidden under a deteriorating portion of the base wall, an individual brick shifted ever so slightly. Dad gently pried it free. Just beyond it, there's a little empty area. Within, you'll find a worn silver key and a piece of paper that has been wrapped up. I nervously unfolded the fragile paper. Even though the ink had faded, the spidery calligraphy was legible. This entry was made in a diary in 1923. There was the word, "They know," printed within. They are aware of my actions. The evidence must be concealed. The well, the key. She will never be found there. This made my body shiver. Oh, really? In the unkempt backyard, there was a long-lost well. Everyone had told us to avoid it, but now, with the growing urgency of the voices, we hurried outdoors. With his doubts completely dispelled, Dad lifted the heavy wooden lid from the well. There was an awful smell that rose into the air. As we lowered the beam into the pitch black, we saw it. From the dark depths, a skeleton hand emerges. Officers were sent. A tiny lockable wooden box and the body parts of a young lady were found when they dug the well. The basement key worked well. The box included a picture album and letters that told a tale of forbidden love, betrayal and murder. It seemed as if the victim's tortured screams were the whispers, and she was at last able to speak out about her terrible secret after all this time. Once it happened, the home changed forever. A somber stillness, an enduring feeling of loss, replaced the hushed murmurs. Not long after that, we departed. The stately Victorian at 12 Oakhaven Lane retains its magnificent facade and sinister secret. I swear there are moments when I can still make out their voices, almost as if they were whispering. Story 2. The difficult chore of going through my grandmother's stuff started when I inherited her home in Salem, Massachusetts, a charming two-story colonial at 7 Hawthorne Place. The home was filled to the brim with Gran's cherished possessions, since she had a tendency to hoard. In the course of my investigation, I discovered the long-lost chamber. While investigating the attic, a dark, filthy room full of cobwebs and long-lost memories, I came onto a part of the wall that appeared different. A door-like shape was just visible in the wallpaper, and the patterns didn't exactly match. I ran my fingers down the wall, hoping to find a handle or lock. My curiosity stirred. Something tiny and shiny brushed across my fingertips, occupying a keyhole. Surprisingly, one of the old keys I had discovered earlier fit, so I dug through the box to find it. The secret door creaked open, exposing a tiny square chamber that didn't appear on the floor plans. It swung inward with a snap. The place seemed to have been frozen in time, with an eerie preservation. A dirty window let in a sliver of light, and dust motes twirled in it. Dried lavender and the smell of decaying wood permeated the atmosphere. At the room's center was a child's rocking rocker, encircled by an assortment of vintage toys. A porcelain doll with lifeless eyes, a wooden rocking horse, and a stack of weathered storybooks. I felt uneasy. In the days that followed, I meticulously cleaned the room and made a list of everything in it. The toys were priceless, with some having been around since the late 1800s. A local antique dealer informed me of them high monetary value. The rocking rocker, however, was the real draw for me. The delicate carvings of vines and flowers gave it a stunning appearance. A peculiar feeling of familiarity captivated me. I couldn't help but be drawn in. The swaying motion then began. On the first night, I thought it was all in my head. A squeak from the ancient home, a breeze causing the drapes to fluff. However, it resurfaced the next night. From up in the attic comes a quiet, repetitive squeak. With my pulse racing, I skulked upstairs and peeked through the gap in the concealed door. It seemed as if someone or something were inhabiting the rocking chair as it swayed softly from side to side. I tried to convince myself that it was just the wind, but the windows were tightly shut. There was complete silence in the attic. I felt a chill run down my back as the swaying continued in its mesmerizing pattern. No matter how many nights passed, the rocking remained. Despite my best efforts to tune it out, the noise persisted and began to negatively impact my daily life. My dreams began to depict a little girl in a rocking rocker, with her face veiled in darkness. I finally snapped one night. I climbed into the attic, flashlight in hand, ready to face whatever was generating the rocking. I could no longer hear the swaying as I neared the secret chamber. There was an ear-piercing quiet. Stepping inside, I pried open the door. An unsettling moonlight illuminated the chamber. Seated there in the room's exact middle was the rocking chair. I pointed the beam in every direction, trying to see anything that may account for the rocking, an intruder, a stray animal, anything. Unfortunately, I couldn't find anything. Then I beheld it. A little leather-bound journal rests on the floor next to the rocking rocker. My hands quivered as I took it in. The pages were fragile from age, and the cover was discolored and damaged. A first entry greeted me when I opened it. "Mama says I'm not allowed to play in the attic room anymore," it read, in a childlike handwriting. "Her word is that it's not safe. Nevertheless, I find this place pleasant. It's where I keep my secrets. On sometimes, I even get the sensation that someone else is rocking out with me." A shiver went down my back at the final entry. "Mama's gone," it said proudly. Descending the staircase, she lost her balance and collapsed. It was an accident, they claim. But the reality is something I am aware of. The woman rocking in her chair was the one. She shoved her. Plus, she's shown an interest in playing with me. My heart was thumping when I shut the journal. A chilling, invisible presence was watching me from the rocking rocker, even though it didn't move. Slamming the door shut and locking it, I retreated from the room. Afterwards, I made no more trips to the attic. I promptly sold the home, abandoning the long-forgotten chamber and all its mysteries in the process. However, on occasion, when the night is at its quietest, I can still make out the subtle sound of a rocking chair, which serves as a terrible reminder of the invisible presence that persists at 7 Hawthorne Place. Story 3. Midnight was the exact moment that the doorbell rang first. I was lying in bed, half awake, in my little cottage at 4 Evergreen Terrace in Olympia, Washington, a property I had purchased for its tranquility. I was startled awake by the startling bell. I got out of bed, angry, and thinking it was a drunken youngster pulling a practical joke. The peephole allowed me to sneak a peek. Completely non-existent. The streetlight cast a soft light just on the deserted porch. I gingerly pried open the door. There has been no progress whatsoever. "Kids," I said under my breath while clenching my jaw. Once again, it occurred the next night. It is now midnight. There it is, the doorbell. It is empty. On this occasion, a shiver went down my back. No longer was it humorous. It made me feel uneasy. Above the entrance door, I set up a security camera. On the night that followed, I patiently waited by watching the live broadcast on my phone. The doorbell rang at midnight. I saw it on the television. Standing on my doorstep is a dark figure, tall and slim. It seemed veiled by a thin veil. It was hazy and hard to make out. I hurried to the door and threw it open, but the person had already disappeared. Gone. No trace of it at all. I went over the video, picture by picture. Shortly before the doorbell rang, the figure materialized, and as soon as the door swung open, it vanished. It was impossible for someone to act so swiftly. It was just not doable. I notified the authorities. They were courteous, but naturally wary. After searching the neighborhood without success, they recommended that I upgrade my security system. As if I were hallucinating, I felt completely stupid. Though I was aware of what I had seen, noontime drop-ins persisted. Throughout the night, with remarkable accuracy, the same enigmatic figure appears and vanishes. The build-up to midnight had been bothering me all day, and I began to fear it. I had trouble sleeping and focusing. In my own house, I was becoming a captive. I tried something new one night since I was in such a rush to find out what had happened. I waited a moment before opening the door. My pulse was racing as I fixed my eyes on the man in the surveillance feed. On the porch, it remained still, its ethereal figure glistening in the moonlight. Gently lifting its hand, it then indicated flower bed next to the porch. I hurriedly grabbed a shovel and dashed outside. Obviously, the figure had vanished. However, I proceeded to the flower bed and began to dig. Soil was loose and had been disturbed not long before. My shovel hit a solid object after waiting a few minutes. I knelt down and clawed the dirt away in a panic. This was just a little wooden crate. Within, on top of a bed of worn velvet, was a tarnished silver pendant. Naturally, I tore it open. There were 2 little pictures inside. One depicted a young lady who smiled softly and had nice eyes. I was the other one. To be more precise, someone who bore an uncanny resemblance to my appearance. I devoted the next few days to learning my home's history. Elias Thorne, a rich businessman, had it constructed in the early 1900s, as I learned. In 1928, his wife Eleanor vanished without a trace. Nobody ever located her corpse. The disappearance of Eleanor was covered in an old newspaper piece that I came upon. There was a picture of a lady that was an exact replica of the one in the locket. Suddenly, I saw it. The snapshot shows a tall, slim guy with a recognizable face standing next to Eleanor. There I was. my identical twin, presented by Elias Thorne. It dawned on me that the nocturnal visitor wasn't attempting to frighten me. Something was attempting to communicate with me. The truth was attempting to be revealed to me. I now understood that my flower bed was where Eleanor's corpse was buried. After burying her there, Elias, overcome with sorrow and shame, vanished, abandoning the home and his secret. The cops were contacted once again. For once, they paid attention. They discovered Eleanor's body when they dug up the flower bed. After over a century of enigmatization, the case was finally resolved. Visits at midnight ceased. No one ever saw the enigmatic person return. Along with bringing Eleanor's soul some much-needed relief, I uncovered a disturbing link to my own history that has been with me ever since. Story 4. I started my infatuation in a harmless way. The old mirror was hiding in a dusty corner of a Charleston, South Carolina yard sale when I discovered it. The glass reflected a warped, almost otherworldly picture, and the faux metal was tarnished from age. The frame was elaborate. Being a sucker for antique treasures, I couldn't resist the $20 bargain. Returning to my little abode at 22 Rainbow Row, a structure steeped in history, I carried it with me. I thought it was a lovely, although somewhat unsettling, accent piece for my living room at first. However, a shift began to occur. Little details. To me, my reflection felt off. The change isn't huge, but it's noticeable enough to make me stop and examine my reflection in the mirror. There was a moment when I couldn't help but notice something, an expression that wasn't really me. I wrote it off as a result of the old glass's flaws or light trickery. Nevertheless, the disparities intensified. Sometimes, my reflection would seem to be unable to keep up with my actions. It would sometimes act ahead of me, imitating movements I hadn't even thought of yet. It was like the mirror was being invaded by something else. As I stood in front of the mirror one night fixing my tie, I felt ready to hit the town. In the mirror, I saw a grin. Teeth that were too pointed and sharp flashed in an unnerving broad smile. My heart sank, and I went dead. The expression in the reflection remained unchanged. Its eyes gleamed with an evil intelligence as it peered back at me. My hurry caused me to fall back, and I even knocked down a light. The reflection of the grin faded. A flawless, albeit somewhat warped, reflection of myself reappeared in my mirror. My pulse was racing as I gazed at the reflection in the mirror. I was both afraid and intrigued. I began reading up on the background of antique mirrors. I studied up on the beliefs that surrounded them, such the idea that they may be doors to other worlds, a prison for spirits, and a mirror for our innermost thoughts and feelings as well as our outward appearance. I couldn't stop staring in the mirror. It enticed me too much to resist. Hours would pass while I peered into its depths, hoping to get a glimpse of anything else. A disturbing grin, sluggish motions, anticipating hand gestures. They intensified and multiplied. It seemed like the thing confined to the mirror was becoming more powerful, and its impact was permeating my reality. I awoke one night to see that I was standing before the mirror. The act of getting out of bed slipped my mind. Once again, my mirror betrayed me with that terrible grin. It communicated this time. I could make out its barely faint, ragged whisper. "You should let me in," it growled. "Just let me out." A shiver ran down my spine. Something invisible held me still, and no matter how much I wanted to flee or scream, I couldn't move. A long skeleton hand extended by the reflection contacted the mirror's surface. It seemed as if a stone had disturbed the water. The glass rippled. Spiderwebs spread over the surface as a fissure emerged. Out of my stupor, I jolted. My world came crashing down as I bolted out of my flat and into the darkness. Without ever returning, I felt engulfed. I departed from everything that I had. Everything in the apartment, the furnishings, the mirror. In the end, I have no idea what became of the mirror. Please don't tell me. Still, I do see it in my dreams on occasion. The broken glass, the tarnished silver, and the elaborate frame. The mirror, with its menacing grin and sparkling eyes, is only waiting for an opportunity to escape. It will happen, I am confident of it, with a terrifying certainty. Story 5. I couldn't have been happier about relocating to Unit 7 at 123 Santa Monica Boulevard, an ancient warehouse conversion in Los Angeles' Arts District. I had always dreamed of living in an apartment with exposed brick, high ceilings, and large windows that looked out over the city. Being a converted textile mill, the structure had an air of hazy industrialism and a touch of bohemia. It was brilliant. I did initially anyhow. It seemed subtle at first. It seemed like someone was walking in the flat above me. A slight tapping sound. It would ring out while I worked late into the night, the city lights dazzling outside my window. Repeatedly tap. The edifice reverberated with the steady patter of footfalls. I would have gone upstairs to see, but the flat above me was deserted. According to the building management, it had been going on for months. More and more, the sound of approaching footfall became audible. They followed me as if on a trail. As I made my way from the kitchen to the living room, I would hear footsteps that mirrored my own, as if I were accompanied by an ethereal ghost. Repeatedly tap, never more than a few paces behind. I attempted to find an explanation. I reassured myself that the old structure was settling, the city's noises reverberating through the air vents. The steps, however, were too exact and methodical. Without a doubt, they had entered the premises and were intent on pursuing me. I was startled out of slumber one night when I heard footsteps outside my bedroom door. Repeatedly tap. While listening, I exhaled slowly. All sound of footfall ceased. After then, there was a slow, purposeful scratching sound, like someone was attempting to open the door. My chest tightened with anguish. I quickly reached for my phone and rang. The cops showed up in no time. Every room, corridor, and floor of the building was combed through. They came up empty-handed. No footsteps, no indication of a break-in, no invader. They said it was like a nightmare, but I was sure I hadn't. Those were actual footsteps. I could still make out their muted but unmistakable echoes reverberating around the structure. Repeatedly tap. I began to investigate the structure on my own, propelled by an increasing feeling of terror. Even though it wasn't shown on the blueprints, I found a secret stairway concealed behind a fire door. The path continued into a damp, shadowy sub-basement where abandoned tools and other relics were scattered around. The stench of dust and mildew permeated the sub-basement. As they reverberated off the concrete walls, the footsteps became louder below. Repeatedly tap. Their guidance appeared to be pulling me farther into the shadows. I went to a distant area of the basement where I could make out the sound of footsteps. An old stack of boxes concealed a little wooden door, which I discovered there. Unfortunately, the wood was decaying and falling apart, and it was locked. I forcefully opened it. Beyond it, there was a tiny, windowless chamber that was no larger than a closet. I saw it at the room's middle. Restrained to the wall is a skeleton. In the pale light of my flashlight, its brittle bones reflected a smile on its face as I examined its skull. A little worn-out silver pendant held in its bony hand. I took the locket into my hands and opened it. Upon closer inspection, one may see a little image of a girl with a haunting grin and sorrowful eyes. The engraving reads, "Eleanor, forever mine." On the reverse side of the locket, Eleanor, I found out later on, was a textile worker who went missing in the 1920s. Nobody ever located her corpse. There was never sufficient evidence to accuse Silas Blackwood, the factory owner, of her murder. The sound of Eleanor's footsteps reverberated through the structure, a constant reminder that she was ensnared by her assailant. She had guided me to her mortal remains, where she could now rest easy. I left the converted warehouse not long after that. The idea of living in an area tainted by such a sorrowful past is intolerable to me. Nevertheless, on occasion, even in the dead of night, I can make out the subtle tapping sound of footfall, a terrifying reminder of the invisible presence that persists at 123 Santa Monica Boulevard, Unit 7. Story 6. We had just relocated to 15 Maple Lane, a gorgeous but somewhat run-down home in rural Vermont that my parents had purchased for a pittance. At 12 years old, I was a brat who didn't want to leave the safety and security of my suburban home or my pals. As a lone adventurer in a strange and foreign environment, I found that exploring the ancient home was the best way to stake out my new territory. The diary was discovered during one of these expeditions. A little book with worn gold writing and wrapped in leather was hidden behind a loose floorboard in my bedroom. The age-related fragility of the pages was accompanied with fading yet readable ink. The journal belonged to Alara, a little girl who had lived in the home over a century ago. Details of rural life's humdrum daily activities dominated the initial entries. Alara documented her daily activities, academic progress, and relationship with her cat, Jasper. However, the entries became more unsettling as I continued reading. Alara started documenting unexplained phenomena in the home. An eerie presence lurks in the shadows, items in her room move without human intervention, and she hears whispers in the dark. The tone of the entries then became more sinister. As Alara put it in her writing, something or someone is usually lurking just out of sight, and she often feels followed. Nightmares, she said, featuring a shadowy creature with flaming red eyes. In her writing, the apparition referred to itself as the Shadow Man. I wrote it off as the product of a child's wild imagination, a terrifying tale she made up to terrify herself. However, I began to experience some peculiar events. Similar to Alara, I would also hear voices in the dark. On the outside of my field of vision, I would see shifting shadows. Things would vanish from one spot and then resurface in another. My dreams began to resemble Alara's, including a shadowy creature with flaming red eyes. As I perused Alara's journal one night, I came upon an entry that gave me the willies. The Shadow Man confided in me a secret, she writes. He claimed to make his home in the well. He expressed an interest in playing with me. He asked me to go down to the well, he said. This made my body shiver. Just as in Alara's journal, there was a long-gone, deserted well in the garden. I felt a strong pull toward it, driven to verify Alara's narrative, despite my parents' warnings that I should avoid it. I did not get any sleep that night. I couldn't shake the mental picture of the Shadow Man. Some invisible force drew me out of bed, and I skulked downstairs. I crept out the rear entrance and into the darkness. An ominous darkness enveloped the backyard as the moon remained shrouded in a dense cloud cover. My heart was racing as I made my way to the well. Nearby, in a barely audible whisper, I recognized a voice that sent shivers down my spine. A low hiss came from it, and it mentioned Alara. Join me in this game. A chill ran down my spine as my blood froze. Something invisible held me still, and no matter how much I wanted to flee or scream, I couldn't move. The hushed murmurs became more strident. A low hiss came from it, and it mentioned Alara. Please descend to the well. The hushed murmurs followed me as I bolted in the other direction of the home. As soon as I swung open the rear door, I locked it and forcefully shut it. I sprinted to my bedroom and dove under the covers, shaking with terror. After that, I avoided the well at all costs. For fear of discovering anything embarrassing, I put Alara's journal down. A terrifying reminder of the invisible presence lurking in the shadows of 15 Maple Lane persisted, albeit faintly, in the form of whispers. Also, sometimes, deep in the night, I would catch a faint sound, a voice that sounded very like to Ilara's calling out to me. The sound of a voice that begged me to descend to the well. Story 7. My new Chicago apartment, a warm one-bedroom on the 12th floor of a skyscraper at 456 Michigan Avenue, was the target of the calls not long after I moved there. They were first just weird. One ring, then dead air. It seemed like the incorrect number to me. Call frequency, however, increased thereafter. 3 rings. No sound, just one ring. Every single day at exactly 3:17 a.m. I verified the caller ID. Despite its consistency, the number seemed strange. The call wouldn't connect when I attempted to return the call. I was told by a robotic voice that the number I had phoned is no longer in service. My phone provider was contacted by me. They looked up the number. According to their confirmation, it was unplugged, out of commission. They were at a loss as to why I was still getting calls from it. No matter how many nights passed, the calls persisted. 3 rings, no sound, remaining constant at 3:17 a.m. For others, the noise became an insomniac's worst nightmare, a constant reminder of the unease that comes with living in the dark. I picked up the phone one night because I needed answers badly. The phone rang at 3:17 a.m. This one I took up. No sound. Then a hoarse, old voice, scarcely heard, said, "Assist me," it said low. "I am about to be attacked." The signal was lost. It jolted me. This was no laughing matter. It had a different quality, something ominous. I was disturbed by the muttered cry for assistance. Could you tell me who that was? What exactly were they scared of? My interest in the building's past prompted me to begin investigating it. I found out that it had been constructed on the foundation of a former speakeasy, a legendary prohibition hangout for bootleggers and criminals. A story from 1933 detailing a murder that occurred at the speakeasy was located in an old newspaper. The lifeless corpse of a young lady, Delilah, had been discovered in the basement, battered to death. Nothing came of the investigation. The bartender who had seen Delilah's argument with a guy before she vanished was named as a witness in the piece. The individual was never located, despite the bartender providing a description of him to the authorities. A shiver went down my back as I read the description. The bartender had described the guy as towering above everyone, with a thick beard and intensely blue eyes. A fedora and a black suit were his previous attire. The guy I had dreamed about was exactly like the one described. "Help me," said the guy. It was at that moment that I understood the phantom phone calls were illogical. They were emanating from Delilah, whose soul was ensnared in the structure, pleading for rescue. Her intention was to convey some message to me. She was attempting to inform me of her killer's identity. The cops were notified. I filled them in on everything from the dream guy to the phone calls and the newspaper piece. Despite their initial skepticism, they ultimately decided to reopen the case. After searching the building's basement, they uncovered a secret compartment that had been used to keep the illicit wine from the speakeasy. They discovered it there, concealed behind a fake wall. An undead figure, hatted and clad in a black suit, holding a tarnished silver locket in its skeleton hand. A little image of a young lady with sorrowful eyes and an eerie grin rests inside the locket. Lady Delilah. The bones were positively recognized by the authorities as those of Victor the Viper Moretti, the proprietor of the speakeasy. It emerged that Moretti had a romantic relationship with Delilah. He had slain her in an angry outburst after they had fought. The phantom phone calls ceased after Moretti's body was located, and the truth was eventually known. With her soul at rest, Delilah was free to go on. However, in the recesses of my imagination, I can still hear her hushed cry for aid, a haunting reminder of a murder that went unsolved for over 100 years. In the quiet of the night, I sometimes catch what seems like the distant ring of a long-gone phone, a spectral remnant from another time. Story 8. It all began with a little, unimportant thing. Our Springfield, Illinois house at 6 Lilac Lane was formerly graced with a porcelain owl, a whimsical keepsake from our journey to Branson, Missouri, which graced the mantel of our living room. By daybreak, it was gone. We looked everything around, in the waste, behind the bookshelf, behind the couch. It was just gone. Rosalind, my wife, responded, probably just misplaced it, but her bewildered expression betrayed her confusion. Rosalind had an almost pathological need for order. It was just not her style to lose anything. Sometime after that, something bigger vanished. A floor lamp that is located in the living room's corner. Gone. Suddenly disappeared. It was clear to us both this time that something was amiss. Misplacement wasn't the only explanation. This felt off. Then everything became really strange. Once again, the misplaced objects began to resurface. There was the porcelain owl in the fridge, hanging dangerously from an egg carton. In the bathtub, the floor light appeared, all set up and wired in, as if anticipating a surprisingly electric bath. This perplexed us. Every door and window had its lock examined. A security mechanism was set up by us. We went so far as to think that the intruder may be an oddball with an affinity for home decor, but it all didn't add up. As if pushed by an invisible hand, the objects were vanishing and resurfacing with an unexpectedly comical flair. The regularity and ridiculousness of the reappearances and disappearances increased as they persisted. On top of the world, a dining room chair appeared. The freezer revealed a carefully organized collection of books, each one labeled with its author. Out of nowhere, my beloved recliner resurfaced in the garden, balancing perilously on the limbs of our majestic oak tree. We felt as if we were trapped in a bizarre, unnerving comedy. Every morning, we began to dread rising to the prospect of whatever fresh folly was ahead. Things were amiss in the home. The rules of the game it seemed to be playing with us were becoming more and more frightening. One night, I was looking in the guest bedroom's dusty old closet for a lost set of silverware when I discovered a secret chamber at the back. The silverware eventually reappeared, hanging from the ceiling fan. A little wooden box was within. The box had a lock, but it was rusted and ancient. I succeeded in openly removing it. I discovered a notebook and many old images within the box. Serafina, a lady who resided in the home in the early 1900s, was the previous owner, and the diary belonged to her. The diary entry stated that Serafina had been a spiritualist who was preoccupied with mediumship. She thought the home was haunted by a prankster ghost whom she named Bartholomew. Bartholomew liked to pull practical jokes on the living, Serafina wrote, organizing furniture, concealing items, and causing overall mayhem. Bartholomew, in her mind, was a benign, even kind, soul who yearned for simple recognition. I shut the diary as a terrifying conclusion washed over me. Unlike what Serafina had imagined, Bartholomew really existed. Truly he was. He persisted in remaining inside, engaged in his game playing. We thought it would be worth a shot to talk to Bartholomew. Following Serafina's instructions in her notebook, we placed gifts of chocolates and other trinkets. We called out to him, confirming his existence and requesting that he cease his antics. As time went on, the vanishing and resurfacing ceased. Everything went back to as it had been before, even the furnishings. Finally, it seemed as if Bartholomew had been pacified. He had only wished for recognition and remembrance. As a result, we were able to bring some calm back to our house. It was a little unsettling calm, however, since we couldn't shake the feeling that an invisible being shared our space, a spirit full of energy who liked to rearrange furniture and had a very eccentric sense of humor. Story 9. The closed door in the basement has always fascinated me ever since we moved into the historic colonial home in Concord, Massachusetts at 27 Lexington Road. Braced with iron bars, the huge oak door was affixed to the far corner of the foundation wall. It seemed incongruous, ominous. What is its purpose? I consulted my dad. I don't care, he shrugged. Room in the attic, most likely. I guess the previous owners had it sealed up. Handle attempted, keep out. Anyway, I highly doubt there's anything noteworthy in there, which piqued my interest yet. A preoccupation with a locked door developed. How many mysteries was it hiding? Behind this impregnable barrier, what horrors or riches were hidden? I went down the basement and scoured the door, trying to figure out how to unlock it. It took me hours. No matter how many keys I found, they wouldn't fit. It was too old and rusted to pluck, so I gave off trying. I contemplated dismantling it as well, but the strengthened iron bars rendered it an impossibility. For some reason, the closed door just wouldn't go away from my thoughts. My nightmares were plagued by it. The weight of its secrets seemed to be smothering me as I tried to feel them pushing down on me. I found a box of old paperwork one day while I was investigating the attic. In one of them, I discovered the house's initial plans. Before tracing the basement's shape with my finger, I lay them out on the dusty floor. That was it. Doors that are locked. However, the term storage room did not appear on the plans. The name of it was wine cellar. What is a wine cellar? I failed to grasp that. With a door so thick and sturdy, why would anybody ever lock a wine cellar? That is, unless anything else was present below. They were trying to conceal something. With renewed resolve, I made my way back to the basement. I took a closer look at the entrance. Around the frame, I found a tiny, quite imperceptible fissure in the mortar. I hammered a little chisel into the fissure after inserting it. A little fragment of mortar broke off. Once again, I tapped. Still another one. The fissure was widened as I cautiously chipped away at the mortar. The fissure had become large enough for me to fit my fingers inside after several hours of labor. I yanked on the door handle and yanked. The rusted hinges groaned as it swung inward after first resisting. There was a heavy stench of wet dirt and rot permeating the air as one entered the shadowy, musty chamber beyond. There was no light switch, so I groped about in vain. I illuminated the blackness with my flashlight. The light swept over a cramped chamber with a dirt floor. It wasn't a place to store wine. Imagine that, a cell. I saw it at the room's middle. Restrained to the wall is a skeleton. In the pale light of my flashlight, its brittle bones reflected a smile on its face as I examined its skull. Holding a tarnished silver locket in its skeleton hand, I took the locket into my hands and opened it. Upon closer inspection, one may see a little image of a girl with a haunting grin and sorrowful eyes. Abigail, my beloved, is inscribed on the reverse side of the locket. It was only later that I found out that the house's previous owner, Thaddeus, was a rich businessman, and Abigail was his daughter. A forbidden affair that infuriated her father was Abigail's affection for a guy from the stable. Thaddeus had locked Abigail in the basement cell after an angry outburst of jealousy. She starved to death in that jail. It then hit me. Thaddeus had closed the door in an effort to hide his shame and cover up his terrible deed. But hidden in the shadows, ready to be unearthed, was the secret. In addition to releasing a haunting tale from the past, unlocking the door brought to light the fact that even the most picture-perfect houses may have sinister secrets hidden inside. Story 10. Gardening is something I've always enjoyed. There's immense joy in tending to a seed and seeing it blossom into a fully formed being. My new home in Savannah, Georgia, is an exquisite antebellum estate located at 7 Forsyth Park. To my joy, I discovered a large, overgrown garden in the rear upon moving in. An undiscovered paradise, it beckoned with its hushed majesty. On the other hand, the shadows were off. It seemed subtle at first. Whenever I was out in the yard, doing things like trimming rose bushes or pulling weeds, I'd often observe that the shadows weren't quite proportional to what was throwing them. As if the sun were fooling my eyes, the perspective would be ever so slightly wrong and the length warped. I wrote it off as an oddity of the historic garden, the way the light played through the thick tree cover. Nevertheless, the disparities intensified. The shadows started to twist and expand as if propelled by an invisible power, seemingly unrelated to the things that were casting them. After then, the most disturbing part started. The shadows would separate from the items and roam the garden at night, becoming longer and more ominous and taking on forms that couldn't be explained. In the garden, I would sometimes see eerie creatures skulking about in the shadows, darting from tree to tree, and keeping an eye on me. I attempted to find an explanation. Things that move at night, I reminded myself. Moonlight dancing with shadows. However, I had a sneaking suspicion there was more going on. There's something alien. As I tended to the hydrangeas one night, I saw a shadow falling from a massive oak tree. It became longer and thinner until it resembled a human form. In the moonlight, the figure's dark figure shimmered as it slid over the grass towards me. As my heart raced, I went into a frozen state. Something invisible held me still, and no matter how much I wanted to flee or scream, I couldn't move. A persona stopped a little distance from my location. Its gloomy hand went up and pointed at the ground under the oak tree. I reached for a shovel and proceeded to the location where the shadowy figure stood. It all began when I dug. Soil was loose and had been disturbed not long before. My shovel hit a solid object after waiting a few minutes. I knelt down and clawed the dirt away in a panic. This was just a little wooden crate. Within, on top of a bed of worn velvet, was a tarnished silver pendant. Naturally, I tore it open. There were two little pictures inside. A picture of a young guy with warm smile and soft eyes was one of them. One of them was of me. To be more precise, someone who bore an uncanny resemblance to my appearance. It wasn't until much later that I learned the young guy in the locket belonged to the house's former owner, the famous botanist Jasper. His corpse was never discovered after his abduction in the 1800s. Murder had been committed, and his remains were said to be buried in the garden. It dawned on me that the shadowy figure was really Jasper's soul, ensnared in the garden where he liked to care to his plants while yearning to find his murderer. In his quiet need for retribution, he had guided me to the locket, which held the key to his identity. The local historical society was contacted by me. I related the story of the shadows, the locket, and the striking likeness between Jasper and myself. They dug further and found that Jasper's envious and greedy business partner had killed him. The accomplice had revealed Jasper's whereabouts and confessed to the crime as he was dying. His body was discovered entombed under the oak tree, precisely in the spot where the spectral figure had indicated. Once the truth was out, and Jasper's body was located, the mysterious shadows in the garden vanished. Now that Jasper's soul was free, it could go on. However, in the recesses of my consciousness, I can still see the enigmatic figure, the mute gardener caring for his prized plants. In the quiet of the night, I can almost perceive his presence in the garden, a subtle hint of the mysteries that reside under the earth's surface. Story 11. I believed it was a nightmare the first time I heard it. An ear-piercing, spine-tingling scream reverberated through my home at 101 Shoshone Street in Boise, Idaho. a delightful craftsman that I had purchased just a short while before. With my pulse racing and excitement pumping through my veins, I sprang straight out of bed. I was so sure someone was attacking someone in my house that I snatched up my phone and phoned. However, upon arrival, the cops discovered nothing. It seems that there has been no intrusion, and no one appears to be in danger. Every inch of the home, even the cellar and underside of the eaves, was combed through. Completely non-existent. They decided it was only a false alarm caused by something in the street or a stray animal. But I recognized the sound. A human cry, wrought with fear and agony. Additionally, it originated inside my residence. The screaming persisted, happening at irregular intervals, and it never stopped happening while I was home alone. Every time, the rooms would become silent after a single, ear-piercing scream. Being home alone became more of a nightmare for me. As the dread of the next scream built, the suffocating quietness set in. I did my best to describe the cries. My excuse was that the plumbing was broken, whistling breeze through the ancient windows' crevices. However, no one could explain it. The cries sounded too real, too human. As I was clearing up the attic one day, I found a box with old photos and letters. They had belonged to the Callaways, who had lived in the home before. A horrifying narrative started to emerge as I combed through the old photos. A little girl called Willow was born to the Callaways. The letters showed that Willow had been hard of hearing. She was able to express herself using sign language, which her parents had a hard time mastering. Willow just vanished. She evaded capture despite the police's best efforts. Her sad disappearance was still an unsolved mystery. A shiver ran down my spine as I gazed at a snapshot of Willow, a playful little girl with big eyes and a cheeky grin. The sounds I had been picking up on were anything but quiet cries. Ensconced in the home, her cries were unheard by others who couldn't comprehend her language. I became fluent in sign language. I practiced for hours, intent on deciphering Willow's message. A night later, it transpired. The house resounded with the scream. This time, however, I got it. That sound wasn't a cry for help. A warning yell, that was. By means of her muted cries, Willow was attempting to inform me about a secret chamber in the basement, which her folks had utilized as a kind of discipline for her after she had acted up. She died in that chamber after being confined there for so long, afraid and alone. Following the signals that Willow had made with her cries, I descended to the basement. Behind a fake wall was the secret chamber that I discovered. Inside, I discovered Willow's lifeless body and a little wooden doll that she had held firmly in her bony hand. The cops were notified. After looking into it, they agreed with my conclusions. It came out that Willow's parents had unintentionally murdered her while administering one of their punishments. They hid her corpse in the secret chamber, overcome with sadness and shame, attempting to cover up their terrible act. After the truth was ultimately exposed and Willow's remains were retrieved, the silent cries came to a rest. After finding solace, Willow's soul was free to continue its journey. However, in the recesses of my mind, I can still hear the haunting echoes of her sobbing, a haunting reminder of a catastrophe that took place inside my own house. A terribly brief life may sometimes be nearly felt in the quiet of the night, as if she were still here. Story 12. Elias, my grandpa, had an eclectic taste in collecting strange things. An absolute treasure trove of peculiar artifacts could be found in the attic of his long-gone Albuquerque, New Mexico home at 555 San Mateo Lane, Nebraska. The space resounded with the memories of his life. After his death, I became the proud owner of the mansion and all of its belongings, including the cherished relics stored in the attic. Among them was a weathered Bakelite radio with a wooden chassis and dials and knobs that seemed to have stood the test of time. In first, I thought the radio was nothing more than a piece of trash that would end up in the thrift shop. However, I chose to fiddle with it on a rainy day when I was bored and restless. I turned it on without truly anticipating its operation. I was taken aback when the radio suddenly started up, with a slight hiss of static noise coming from the speaker. A voice started echoing across the room while I tinkered with the tuning knob, an unmistakable voice transmitting a news report. From 1947, my mind was blown. Pretending to be in real time, the radio was playing a program that had aired more than 70 years earlier. The announcer's coverage of news from the post-war globe captivated me. It was a place that seemed both familiar and yet alien at the same time. Sitting in the attic, I would listen to the vintage radio night after night. A window into an earlier time, it became a gateway to the past. Many decades worth of music, news bulletins and radio plays were played for me. To go back in time would be an understatement. Something very disturbing occurred then, late one night. A 1953 baseball game was being aired on the radio. A thrilling play, a home run that won the game, was being described by the announcer. In describing the hit, he brought up the player's name, my grandpa Elias. This was the first time I had heard about my grandfather's athleticism and baseball prowess when he was younger. I was engrossed as the announcer recounted my grandfather's courageous deed, the thunderous applause, and the joyful revelry. Afterwards, the announcer made a statement that made me feel uneasy. And young Elias goes to the neighborhood diner to celebrate his win, he said. I hope he's being cautious as he crosses the street. Those drivers from Albuquerque may be very careless. I froze. Automobile tragedy had claimed my grandpa's life. As he crossed the street outside a restaurant, a vehicle ran him down. There in Albuquerque. The radio had foretold his demise. As my pulse raced, I pressed the button to silence the radio. What had just been spoken had very far-reaching consequences. Was all that being played on the radio just an old tape? Maybe it was more than that. Is it a doorway to another world? An insight into what is ahead? For some reason, I kept getting the impression that this was no ordinary radio. It served as a link to a realm beyond our comprehension, a conduit. The power it had captivated me, and my perverse curiosity kept me listening to it night after night. A news story from the future began broadcasting on the radio one night. A huge earthquake had pounded Albuquerque, and the announcer was detailing the disaster. Tomorrow was the day of the earthquake. My heart sank. The next step was unclear to me. Am I able to stop the earthquake? Should I sound the alarm? Was it all a cruel ploy by the old radio, or was it simply a coincidence? I choose to pay attention to the caution. The local authorities were informed about the radio and its prognosis when I contacted them. Despite their natural skepticism, they agreed to exercise cautious. They warned everyone in the city to be ready for an earthquake. Seismic activity peaked the next day, true to form, as foretold by the radio. The warning allowed many lives to be spared, despite the catastrophic occurrence. Thanks to the antique radio, a bridge between the past and the future, my city was spared. The radio is in my possession. Its presence in my living room testifies to the enigmatic nature of things that defy human understanding. For fear of what I may hear, I now listen to it very seldom. Nevertheless, there are moments when, in the darkness of the night, I almost see the subtle crackling of static, a spectral echoes from bygone eras, a murmur from an uncertain future. Story 13. In New Orleans, Louisiana, I inherited my great-aunt Cordelia's home, a stately Victorian estate at 666 Royal Street that is said to be haunted. The property is majestic but showing signs of moderate degradation. Even though I'm not much influenced by superstitions, I couldn't help but get a feeling of foreboding at this location, as if its very walls held a dark past. One specific painting hung in the corridor of the upper apartment, adding to this impression. A dark-suited figure with a menacing expression watched you pass by in the painting. Up until I spotted something. Unnerving, I believed it was typical of ancient pictures. It seemed as if the person in the picture wore doving. The shifts started off little. His expression changed subtly, and he tilted his head slightly. I chalked it up to lighting effects, the way the shadows danced over the paper. The shifts, however, intensified. With unsettling intensity, the person in the photograph seemed to get nearer to me every day. The hallway became my enemy, and I began to take the circuitous route to my bedroom instead. Unfortunately, I couldn't shake the picture. Even when I averted my eyes, I could feel its watchful stare. My nightmares intensified, and I began to see the guy in the painting emerging from the artwork and pursuing me. By the end of one night, I had had enough. With a flashlight in hand, I made my way upstairs, hell-bent on confronting the image and proving to myself that it was all in my head. I held the flashlight up to the picture and illuminated its surface. As the light reflected off his eyes, the man's lips twisted into a subtle, unnerving grin. Then, I beheld it. Just behind the figure's hand, there is a tiny, quite imperceptible fissure in the paint. The fissure has never existed before. I took a closer look at it. A new fissure appeared, as if the paint had been agitated not long before. I extended my hand and felt the fissure. As I ran my finger over the paint, it crumbled, exposing a secret chamber below the canvas. I discovered a little leather-bound notebook inside the container. Alistair, the rich businessman shown in the photograph, was the rightful owner of the notebook. The entries revealed his depraved obsessions, twisted fantasies, and ravenous thirst for power. Everyone who knew him hated and frightened him because he was so vicious and merciless. A shiver went down my back as I read the last entry in the diary. His physical health may be deteriorating, but his soul will continue to shine, he said. There is a way out of this mortal coil, and I shall discover it. I intend to merge with my likeness. While I observe, I am patient. When the moment is perfect to come back, though my heart was racing, I shut the diary. The man's eyes were staring right into mine, and the picture pulsed with an evil force. It dawned on me at that moment that Alistair's soul was ensnared in the painting, his sinister spirit slowly but surely seeping into the canvas, waiting for its opportunity to break free. I removed the painting from its mount and brought it outside. In my backyard, I built a bonfire and tossed the painting into the fire. The picture of Alistair was consumed by the flames as the canvas cracked and exploded, his eyes blazed with a last rebellious stare. I felt a relief, like a burden had been lifted off my shoulders, as the fire subsided. After Alistair left, the home had a different vibe, brighter, lighter. But in the stillness of the night, I can occasionally still feel his eyes on me, a haunting reminder of the shadows that 666 Royal Street once held. Still, I can't help but feel uneasy about the possibility that Alistair isn't really gone, but is instead patiently waiting for his time to come back. Story 14. Evangeline, my daughter, adored dolls. They piled high in her room at 8880 Camelback Road, our Scottsdale, Arizona suburban house, where we shared so much joy and laughter. Dolls of all kinds, from rag dolls to porcelain to plush animals, were strewn around. I didn't give it much thought when she got a classic porcelain doll, a present for her birthday. The doll had rosy cheeks and curling blonde hair. To her, it was only an additional doll. Contrarily, this doll stood out. It seemed subtle at first. After putting the doll on Evangeline's bed over the night, we would discover it in a different room the next morning. There in the kitchen, the living room, and the bathroom as well. As a kid with a vivid imagination, Evangeline said the doll was playing hide and seek and was moving about on its own. The doll's actions became more unnerving as we laughed at her fantastical explanation. After stowing it away in a cabinet, we'd return to find it sitting on Evangeline's bed the next morning, its glassy eyes fixed on her. We searched for an explanation. We reasoned that Evangeline had to be manipulating the doll. Maybe she was dreaming. However, our intuition told us something was off. Evangeline slept well. She was never one to doze off, and there was an excess of purposefulness in the doll's actions. I once awoke in the middle of the night to Evangeline's room making an unusual noise. Peeking inside, I stealthily made my way down the corridor. The moonlight filtered through the window, casting a soft glow over the room. Sleeping soundly on her bed was Evangeline. Additionally, the doll sat on the floor next to her bed, peering at her with an eerie expression. The doll subsequently shifted its position. It cocked its head down and stared at me square in the face. In the pitch blackness, its pupils seemed to light up, and its mouth formed a subtle, unnerving grin. The doll's head immediately returned to Evangeline as my scream echoed. As soon as I entered the room, I snatched the doll. With its glassy eyes fixed forward, its porcelain skin seemed frigid to the touch. I went outside and tossed the doll in the garbage. It was no longer welcome in my home. Returned the next morning was the doll. Perched atop Evangeline's bed, its bespectacled, lifeless eyes fixed on her. Our hearts sank. We were at a loss for action. Everyone from a priest to a psychic to a paranormal investigator was contacted. The actions of the doll were puzzling to everybody, almost like it had life in it. At last, we settled on looking into the doll's background. An antique store in New Orleans was where we tracked it down. Sadly, the shopkeeper informed us that the little girl who had owned the doll had perished in a home fire. According to him, the girl had a serious doll obsession and couldn't stop carrying it around. In his words, the doll was possessed. At that point, we understood the doll wasn't a toy. It served as a channel for the soul of the girl who had passed away. Because of Evangeline's naivete and fondness for dolls, the girl appeared to develop feelings of attachment to her. We decided to give spirit communication a go. Inviting the ghost to communicate with us, we conducted a seance in Evangeline's chamber, and the spirit started to speak ever so subtly. According to her, her name is Lily. She expressed her feelings of isolation to us. All she wanted was a buddy, she told us. We let Lily know that she couldn't remain with us, and that she should find another place to call home. We filled her in on the hereafter and the hope of finding contentment and joy there, and grudgingly, Lily eventually consented. The doll was vanished by the next morning. For good. The loss of her doll was heartbreaking for Evangeline, but she could understand. Lily had moved on to a better place, and she knew it. Even in the dead of night, I can sometimes nearly feel Lily's presence, a soothing, reassuring presence that reminds me that there is hope and serenity to be found, no matter how bad things seem. Story 15. We had proclaimed 18 Prospect Park West, the ancient brownstone in Brooklyn, New York, a house of character despite the somewhat unsettling drafts and creaking floors. And the scratching began a few weeks after we moved there. It started out little and hardly noticeable, somewhat faint scratching noise emanating from inside the walls. We thought it may be mice. The itching continued even after we erected traps and poisoned the area. In both volume and intensity, it increased. The sound of mice scurrying was not it. Something else was going on. Another, more substantial, more, well, human. Someone was pacing the room, clawing at the plaster, and generally attempting to escape from within our walls. We contacted the property owner, An exterminator, a plumber, and an electrician were sent by him in that order. Nobody knew where the scratching was coming from. Everyone just shrugged and assumed the home was just settling. The house wasn't settling, however, since we knew that. It had a different quality, something ominous. We started to feel the uneasy presence of the scratching all the time. We were so wired that we couldn't focus or even sleep. We were constantly on edge, as if someone were hiding out in our house and keeping tabs on us. The itching finally subsided one evening. We listened while holding our breath. There was an ear-piercing quiet, and then we heard it. A low murmur, emanating from inside the confines of the room. "Assist me," it said low. "To escape, I say." This made my body shiver. I didn't see an animal. A real voice had been heard. Our walls were enclosing a person. We found a little concealed room after ripping the plaster off the hallway. We discovered it inside the room. A skeletal figure, its bones fragile from years of wear and tear, clad in worn-out garments. A little worn-out silver pendant held in its bony hand. A little image of a young lady with sorrowful eyes and an eerie grin rests inside the locket. It was only thereafter that we found out the skeleton belonged to Clara, a young lady who had resided in the home in the early 1900s. Clara had provided for her family as a seamstress, putting in long hours in a sweatshop. She vanished without a trace. Her loved ones looked everywhere, but they could never find her. Her sad disappearance was still an unsolved mystery. The landlord was a strong and rich guy, and we found out that Clara had an affair with him. The landlord, who was afraid of a scandal, killed Clara when she got pregnant and buried her corpse in the brownstone secret room. After the truth was ultimately out and Clara's remains were located, the scratching ceased. After finding solace, Clara's soul was free to continue its journey. However, in the recesses of our thoughts, we can still hear her hushed cry for rescue, a haunting reminder of a life that was too soon taken. Even in the darkest of nights, there are echoes that seem like scratching, a spectral echo from bygone days, a testimony to the mysteries that occupy 18 Prospect Park West. Story 16. My Portland, Oregon apartment, Unit 303 at 1111 SW 10th Avenue, is a contemporary construction with no apparent history of weird happenings. The flickering began quietly, with only a quick flicker of the lights. I thought it may have been a broken bulb or a transient spike in the electricity. The flashing, however, continued and even increased in frequency and rhythm. It was deliberate. It followed a pattern. I observed the pattern one evening as I sat in my living room, reading a book. In rapid, alternating blinks, the lights came on and went off. I was .code, encoding. I took out a notepad and paper and began to write down the strobing lights. Rhythmic pattern of dots, dashes, dashes, dots, dots. SOS. There was an SOS signal emanating from the lights. It disturbed me. Can you tell me who sent the message? Plus, what were their intentions? As the lights flickered and faded, I painstakingly copied down each letter of the message. Leave. The lights flashed. It's a warning. My chest tightened with anguish. My heart sank. What kind of risk is involved? Just what was I meant to escape? Without success, I retrieved my phone and attempted to telephone. There was no signal on the phone lines. With each flicker, the lights would go out and the message would come back. See out of here. The risk. Suddenly, I rushed to the window and peered out at the street below. The residents of my apartment complex were mindlessly strolling around, completely unaware of the threat that persisted inside. All of a sudden, the electricity went out. It was pitch black in the flat. With trembling hands, I scrambled to find my flashlight. Then I became aware of its existence. The sound of lights scratching as if emanating from inside the walls. It was the same screeching noise I'd heard in my last flat, the one where the body of the murdered seamstress Clara had been found. This made my body shiver. The light's jerky movement confirmed to me that it wasn't an electrical glitch. It was a warning, a ghost message from Clara, who is attempting to save me the same fate that befell her, who is confined to the structure. I limped my way to the front door in the pitch black. The screeching noise intensified and became closer. I dashed to the door, threw it open, and bolted down the hall. A resounding crash echoed behind me as I sprinted. My apartment's wall had caved in, exposing a secret compartment. As I turned to see it, I saw it inside the room. A skeletal figure, its bones fragile from years of wear and tear, clad in worn-out garments. A little worn-out silver pendant held in its bony hand. A little image of a young lady with sorrowful eyes and an eerie grin rests inside the locket. "Hi, Clara." As the sirens began to sound, I bolted from the building and dashed out into the street. It was a raging inferno. All of the building was consumed by flames as the fire swiftly spread. My home, my apartment, was engulfed by the fire, and I watched in terror. The fire was started by a malfunctioning gas line, which I found out about later. It became clear that the gas pipe had been sabotaged in a malicious way. The fading lights, which were Clara's last-ditch cry for help, had spared my life. 1111 SW 10th Avenue was a place I never returned to. Going back to a location that still reeks of that terrible past is unbearable. The invisible tenant who gave her life to protect mine, Clara, will live on in my memory. Even in the darkest of nights, I sometimes imagine the lights flashing like an ethereal distress signal, a terrifying reminder of the dangers that lie in wait and the ghosts that keep watch over us. Story 17. Presented to me by my grandma was the music box, an old piece, fashioned from rosewood and decorated with mother-of-pearl inlay. The sad waltz that it played echoed the long-lost secrets of our family's mansion at 1301 Fells Point in Baltimore, Maryland, where many lives were lived and lost. Every night, at the exact same moment, the music box would play at 11:57 p.m. Yes, exactly. As we prepared to turn in for the night, the home would be peaceful and the soft music would permeate the air, as if it were coming from the walls. We went through the whole house, opening every cabinet and searching every crevice for the music's origin. However, it eluded our search. There was music, and it seemed like it was coming from everywhere. The enigmatic melody captivated us at first. It breathed new life into the ancient home, while also preserving its history and traditions. However, the music became more unnerving as time went on. The wistful tune crept into our dreams, bringing with it visions of eerie people and hushed dialogue. I made the decision to dance to the music one night. I sneaked around the house, trying to pinpoint where the music was coming from, as it started to play at 11:57 p.m. Following the melody, I entered the library, a place brimming with ancient volumes and long-lost memories. The enormous bookshelf that took up one whole wall seemed to be the source of the music. Running my fingers across the glossy top, I studied the bookshelf intently. I then sensed it, a tiny, almost invisible clasp concealed under the ornate molding. When I pulled the lever, a portion of the bookshelf moved inward, exposing a secret doorway. The air was heavy with the stench of decay and dust, as the corridor was dim and cramped. A feeling of dread washed over me, and I paused. However, I was dragged farther into the shadows by the music's call. A little concealed room was reached when I followed the corridor. Long dancing shadows were formed on the walls by the one flickering light that weakly illuminated the room. I saw it at the very middle of the room, the chime tower, With its lid ajar, it occupied a little tabletop while the eerie tune wafted around the room. A pile of vintage letters and journals was resting next to the music box. Serafina, my great-great-grandmother, was the rightful owner of them. A buried chapter in our family history was exposed by the letters and diaries, which revealed a horrible secret. Once upon a time, Serafina was a brilliant composer and accomplished pianist. However, her brother, an aspiring and charming guy, had stolen her songs and passed them off as his own, obscuring her skill. In her enraged and envious state, Serafina killed her brother and stashed his corpse in the secret room behind the bookshelf. Her brother's favorite toy was the music box that she now cherished. She had left it in the room with him as a last sinister act of vengeance. The music box abruptly ceased playing as I perused Serafina's last journal post. There was an ear-piercing quiet. Then I became aware of its existence, a soft murmur emanating from the darkness. He made off with my music. The low-volume voice purred. He took my life. I dove and dashed back into the library's safety via the secret entrance. The secret room and all of its secrets were once again sealed as I forcefully closed the bookshelf. Returning to the secret room was never in my plans. I couldn't bring myself to go back to a location that still reeks of that terrible past. However, on occasion, when the night is at its quietest, I can almost make out the tinkling tune of the music box, a chilling reminder of the mysteries housed at 1301 Fells Point and the ghosts that haunt the building. Haunted by desires for vengeance and justice. Story 18. During repairs at Four Cliff Road, a gorgeous but weathered beachfront house that I bought a century ago in Nantucket, Massachusetts, discovered the diary. A little book wrapped in leather and locked with a rusted brass key was concealed in a secret chamber under a slack brick in the hearth. Because I am insatiably interested, I was adamant on discovering whatever mysteries it may hold. It was not easy to find the correct key. I tried ancient skeleton keys I found in antique stores and combed through drawers full of keys I had misplaced, but to no avail. Enviously protecting its secrets, the lock remained obstinately locked. My resolve was strengthened by the gnawing frustration. It took weeks of looking, but I finally discovered it. Hidden in an old jewelry box in the attic is a tiny, elaborate key. It was a perfect match. I could finally feel the satisfaction of the lock's pleasing click as it swung open, revealing the secrets of the diary. It was the late 1800s home that Isadora, the owner of the journal, had resided in. She painstakingly dated each entry in her gorgeous, flowing calligraphy. The early writings were somewhat ordinary. They described the routine of a lady whose island home was far from civilization. She documented the ebb and flow of the tides, the local social events, and the weather. I noticed a change in tone as I continued to read the posts. Her remarks took on an air of mystery, a feeling of dread, a creeping anxiety. She documented her experiences of paranormal activity, including hearing footsteps in the hall while she was alone, whispering in the dark, and items shifting about in her home without her intervention. The entries then turned into something very unsettling. In her writings, Isadora detailed her increasing fixation on a dark figure she seen in the corners of her eye, which she took to be an evil spirit trying to get her. In her ever-increasingly frantic efforts to shield herself from the invisible power of the creature, she detailed rituals that she conducted. A shiver went down my back as I read the last entry. "The darkness is engulfing me," she wrote. "The darkness is engulfing me, and I can feel its pull. The next step is very clear to me. I shall be cleansed by the sea. I shall be liberated by the sea." Though my heart was racing, I shut the diary. The narrative of Isadora was a tragic one, a spiral into insanity driven by paranoia and terror. Her statements, however, were more disturbing than that. It was as if her anxiety and terror had crept into the home itself, hiding in the shadows and ready to pounce on some unsuspecting victim. Strange things began to happen to me as well. I heard footsteps in the corridor while I was alone myself. Mute murmurs of the night. Things that float around independently. From time to time, I would get a glimpse of a mysterious figure, like the ones described in Isadora's notebook, hiding in the shadows. In an effort to put it out of my mind, I attributed it to the power of Isadora's narrative. However, the events continued, becoming both more regular and more severe with time. Like Isadora, I began to feel followed and observed. I was succumbing to the same worry and terror that had pushed her over the edge. When I awoke one night, I was on the edge of a cliff, staring out at the angry ocean. The act of getting out of bed slipped my mind. Making my way to the edge is a memory hazard for me. As I saw the roiling sea below and the waves pounding on the rocks, an eerie need, a whisper of allure, beckoned me to leap. It was at that moment that I knew Isadora's madness and sorrow were still alive and well in the home, beckoning me to join her in the abyss. The alluring murmur of the ocean was pulling me, but I resisted. I dove backwards and dashed towards the house, seeking refuge in the light. Leaving Nantucket and its mysteries behind, I departed the next day. For fear of releasing the evil that lurked inside, I never again opened the diary. Darkness can lurk in the shadows of even the most beautiful settings, and on occasion, I can still hear Isadora's whispers in the stillness of the night, which is a terrifying reminder of how vulnerable the human mind is. Story 19. The knocking began 1 week after we settled into the 9 Last Chance Gulch Victorian home in Helena, Montana. The house had a certain allure, despite the somewhat unsettling silence. In every case, it was the same. The silence of the night was broken by 3 stinging raps. There is a constant 2-3 a.m., constantly emanating from the same location, the wall of the master bedroom, just next to the fireplace. Initially, we attributed the noises to the house sinking and the expansion and contraction of the ancient pipes. But we started to feel irritated by the knock's regularity, accuracy, and persistence. There was no involuntary squeak or moan. Someone or something was clearly attempting to get our attention, since it was a very purposeful knock. It was our mission to find out. We felt around for hidden panels or compartments, listened for cracks, and tapped on the wall. No results were found. The barrier seemed solid, unbreakable. In the stillness of our house, the midnight pounding persisted, a steady, disturbing beat. The spirit of a former resident attempting to contact us became a ghost, according to my wife Lorelei. As usual, I was skeptical and rejected her explanation, thinking the noise must have been caused by an irregularity in the building's architecture. Still, I couldn't shake the idea that someone else was in the home with us, and the mounting discomfort that came with it. I decided to look into it further one night, motivated by a combination of fear and curiosity. I got a hammer and chisel and headed to the wall at 2:03 in the morning as 3 harsh raps resounded around the bedroom. I pounded the area lightly with the hammer after placing the chisel against the apparent source of the knock. A little fragment of plaster broke away, exposing a gaping hole behind the wall. With careful chipping of the plaster, I expanded the hole until I could see inside. Only a few inches of depth separated the 2 halves of the depression. I saw it concealed in the shadows. Little parchment, tightly folded up. I took my time unrolling the parchment. Age had made the paper fragile, but the faded yet readable ink remained. A lady called Genevieve had penned the letter, which bore the year 1888. "Know that I am ensnared to anyone finds this," the letter started. "These barriers have ensnared me because my spouse is a vicious and envious guy. I am terrified that I shall perish. Please share my tale if you come across this male. Declare his actions against me to the world." This made my body shiver. There was no spectre behind the nightly rap. It was Genevieve, ensnared inside the walls, her cries for rescue resonating through the ages. The local historical society was approached by us. After looking into the matter, they found that Phineas, a well-known businessman and Genevieve's husband, had killed her and hidden her corpse inside the mansion. For more than 100 years, his crime remained concealed behind an apparently harmless wall. After hearing Genevieve's tale, the nightly knocking stopped. She was finally able to let her spirit go. However, deep inside our thoughts, we can still feel the haunting presence of a heartbreaking appeal, a haunting reminder of a life cruelly abruptly ended. In the quiet of the night, on occasion, we can just make out the echoes of 3 sharp raps, a spectral knock from long ago, a testimony to the mysteries that enshroud 9 Last Chance Gulch. Story 20. It all began with a glint, a little movement just beyond my field of view. At 123 Barton Springs Road in Austin, Texas, I would be working late into the night in my home office, staring out over the peaceful, tree-lined neighborhood. And then I would see it. Against the dimly lighted interior, a shadow casts itself across the street in the house's window. At first, I disregarded it. My rationale was that it was just a play of light, a car's reflection in the water. However, the glances intensified and persisted. Standing still in the window, the shadow of a tall, thin person watched me every time. I attempted to find an explanation. I figured it was probably just a neighbor. It may be someone coming into bed, or it could be someone pondering something quietly by the window. The shadow, nevertheless, had a disturbing quality. Nothing happened. Its presence was an eerie reminder that I was being watched as it remained still, quietly observing me. I decided to look into it one night. With my binoculars in hand, I zeroed in on the window located across the street. As usual, the shadow was cast against the interior's low lighting, creating a gloomy silhouette. I stared at it for what seemed like an eternity, hoping it would finally break its spell of quiet vigilance. This, however, remained immobile. It did nothing more than stand and observe me. After then, an odd item caught my eye. Across the street, there was a deserted home. After the previous owners departed, it remained deserted for a considerable amount of time. Nobody ought to have been inside, much less the enigmatic person peering out the window. This made my body shiver. My pulse was racing as I lowered the binoculars. At that moment, I realized the shadow wasn't a mere neighbor or a light illusion. It had a different quality, a mysterious quality. Night after night, the shadow reappeared at the window, its solemn watch unwavering. I made an effort to disregard it, to act as if it didn't exist. However, its existence became an ongoing cause for concern, a terrifying reminder that something I couldn't fathom was keeping tabs on me. Late one night, I chose to face the darkness head-on because I needed answers badly. I stepped outdoors and made my way across the street to the deserted home. The shadow appeared to enlarge and became more frightening as I drew near the glass. My heart was thumping, and I came to a sudden halt some feet away. Nothing greeted my gaze when I peered out the window. As anticipated, the room was deserted. The phantom had vanished. Then I became aware of its existence. Someone behind me is whispering softly. "Assist me," the low voice said. "I am about to be attacked." I whirled around, but nobody was in sight. Uninhabited, the street was illuminated by the unsettling light of the street lamps. The source of the whisper seemed to be everywhere, and nowhere at the same time. With my pulse racing, I sprinted back to my home. Squatting in the dark, I listened for the murmured voice or any movement in the shadows after locking the doors and windows. I looked into the neighboring houses past the next day. I learned that in the 1920s it had played host to a terrible murder-suicide. Cordelia, a young lady, had murdered her spouse before ending her own life. According to the legend, Cordelia's soul lingered in the mansion, caught between dimensions, yearning for freedom. The shadow in the glass wasn't attempting to frighten me. I knew at that moment. Its intention was to convey some message to me. It was Cordelia's ghost pleading for rescue from within the home. Something she was trying to tell me was important, but I didn't get it. The shadow remained a mystery to me. In the quiet of the night, however, I can occasionally make out her hushed murmurs. They serve as a haunting reminder of the terrible events that took place in the home across the street and of the ghosts who haunt the darkness, looking for some kind of relief. Story 21. All my dreams came true when I moved into my new house in Concord, New Hampshire, a lovely colonial with a large garden at 1776 Old Northbridge Road. The garden, however, seemed to be acting independently, which was the only strange thing about it. The rose bushes would go from being overflowing with colorful blossoms one minute to looking lifeless and brown the next, as if a whole season had gone by in the blink of an eye. In a similar vein, the vegetable patch would generate seedlings one night and mature product the next. Inexplicably, the garden seemed to be being cared for by an invisible hand, speeding up its natural cycles. When I first saw the drastic changes, I thought it was due to a peculiar microclimate or an anomaly in the local weather patterns. However, the shifts were too noticeable and pinpointed to be accounted for by random chance. The plants seemed to be receiving supernatural care from an unseen gardener, as if they were being nurtured by a spectral hand. I saw it one evening as the garden began to fade into darkness, a glimmering see-through figure making its way through the flower beds. Its edges were fuzzy and hazy, like it had been fashioned from moonlight and mist, and its form was somewhat human-like. I was captivated and unsettled by the figure's graceful and precise movements. The roses were clipped, the flower beds were weeded, and the plants were watered. The plant's growth and decay seemed to be hastened by its touch. I crouched in the porch's shade and watched, my pulse racing. I was both afraid and intrigued. Ignoring my presence, the spectral gardener persisted in its labor, its every step accompanied by a delicate, otherworldly murmur, almost like a lullaby. When I woke up the next morning, the garden had changed. The fragrant roses were in full bloom, with colorful petals that wafted into the air. There was an abundance of ripe vegetables in the vegetable patch. The garden seemed to be brimming with an unnatural vibrancy, as if the spectral gardener had released all of its energy and life force into it. My investigation into the home and garden's past began with a search engine. I learned that the previous owner, Jasper, had a deep love for gardening and had spent his whole life tending to unique and uncommon plants. His heart had given out as he was tending to his roses in the garden, and his death had come as a complete shock. I suddenly understood that the spectral gardener was really Jasper, whose soul remained ensconced in the garden and so carried on tending to it even after he passed away. He wasn't a bad guy, rather, he was a kind spirit, tending to the plants he'd cherished throughout his lifetime. Jasper was going about his gardening duties, so I figured it was best to just let him alone. I struck up a conversation with him, offering him gardening assistance and sharing some of my own gardening expertise. Surprisingly, the garden seemed to have some kind of response. The plants flourished, producing more robust and healthy growth than previously seen. In his spectral form, Jasper seemed to be assisting me like a gardener, imparting his wisdom and illuminating my path. As I worked in the garden, the spectral gardener became an insidious companion. Thanks to his invisible help, I grew to embrace his presence rather than dread him. As I tend to the garden in the evenings, I sometimes sense Jasper's presence, a gentle reminder that love and passion know no bounds, even in the face of mortality. Story 22. As I was organizing the attic of my family's historic Victorian house in Cape May, New Jersey, 2 Ocean Drive, I discovered a worn-out trunk. The house is haunted by memories of bygone eras. The snapshot was tucked within, amid the yellowed lettering and fading lace. The family stood sternly in front of the home in a sepia-toned photograph, their expressions solemn and their attire stuffy. A typical late 19th century family picture, unless you consider one disturbing aspect. An enigmatic, cloaked creature waited in the wings behind the family. As if it had shifted in motion throughout the photography process, it seemed fuzzy and almost out of focus. The darkness made its features hard to see, but I could see the thin, towering form that seemed to exude an ominous air of danger. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light or a double exposure, some kind of photographic oddity. However, uneasiness gradually set me as I perused the snapshot more closely. It seemed as if the enigmatic figure was too focused and ever-present. It wasn't an image quality issue. It had a different quality. Lysander, my spouse, saw the picture. He agreed with my first impression, the pragmatic realist, that the enigmatic figure was an artifact of the image. The image made us feel uneasy, as if we were staring at something not unnatural. And even he couldn't deny it. We chose to investigate the background of the home and family shown in the snapshot. We learned that they were the Winthrops, the house's original proprietors. Tragic occurrences compelled them to leave the farm after numerous generations of living there. Rumors and conjecture clouded the specifics, but the tales alluded to a hidden tragedy that had thrown a shadow over the family and their house. A terrible secret. An enigmatic person often appears in the backdrop of family photos, which became more apparent as we explored the Winthrop family tree. A tall and slim figure would constantly emerge from the shadows, its features hidden, and an air of menacing foreboding hanging in the air. As if it were a portent of disaster, a bystander to the family's sad fall, the figure seemed to be observing, waiting. After then, the most disturbing part started. Even in our own family photos, we began to see the enigmatic figure. The Winthrop family's terrible destiny would be haunted by its presence as it lurked in the shadows in the background. We searched for an explanation. We rationalized it by saying it was only a coincidence, an optical illusion. However, the figure's lingering presence and striking likeness to the mysterious person in the vintage picture made it harder to ignore. Looking at an old family picture one night, I saw something that made me shudder. Not only was the enigmatic figure there, but it was actively involved. I could feel its dark hand on my shoulder as it stood by my side, its veiled face turned towards me, like if it were muttering a secret or a warning. Abandoning the mansion and its disturbing past, we departed Cape May not long after. Fearing what could be lurking in the shadows, we never took another family portrait. Still, we can't shake the image of the eerie figure, its quiet, frightening presence, as a terrifying reminder of the secrets of the past and the ghosts who lurk in the shadows, waiting for their chance to strike. Story 23. For a weekend hideaway, away from the hustle and bustle of city life, my husband Oberon and I purchased the historic farmhouse at 7 Von Trapp Lane in Stowe, Vermont. The property is gorgeous, set among rolling hills and green meadows. The house's worn wood and squeaky floors spoke a tale of its past. What unnerved us, however, was not the house's past. The laughing was the thing. It began softly, like a kid playing hide-and-seek in the dark, with a little laugh resonating through the vacant rooms. At first, we thought it was just the wind blowing through the ancient windows, or maybe the squirrels chatting in the attic. However, the laughing continued, increasing in volume and tone until it was almost mocking. It felt like it happened every time. Twilight, that beautiful transitional period between day and night, when the sun sets and dreams take flight. A disturbing mix of merriment and danger would permeate the air as the laughter reverberated around the home, rebounding off the walls. We searched for an explanation. We convinced ourselves that it was likely due to the unique acoustics of the historic home, the echo that reverberated through the deserted rooms. However, it was too obvious, too human, to be laughing. The sound was reminiscent of a child's giggle, which had an infectious melody and a sinister undertone. As the sound of laughing resounded throughout the home one night, we made up our minds to look into it. We combed through every single room, cabinet, every crevice. In the midst of our panic, we even used flashlights to search the basement and attic. Yet, we came up empty-handed. Nobody lived there, unless you count the giggles. We began looking into the house's past. A big family, the Ashworths, had lived there in the past, as we learned. Ilara, the youngest of their children, was killed in a terrible accident. They had lived there for centuries. It was said that Ilara had been playing in the woods behind the home when she tragically perished after falling into an abandoned well. At that moment, we understood that the reverberating laughing wasn't caused by just wind or squirrels. Ilara was there, her soul confined to the home where she would live out her last moments in anguish. The sound of her own laughter a haunting reminder of a life too soon. In the nearby cemetery, we paid our respects to Ilara's tomb, a little monument adorned with moss. We sent a little figurine, a porcelain doll resembling Ilara's beloved childhood toy, complete with bright cheeks and curling blonde hair, along with some flowers. It was okay to go on, we reassured her soul, and she was loved and cherished. As time went on, the laughing subsided. It reduced in frequency and intensity until it vanished completely. The home fell into a serene and tranquil state as the faint melodies of nature took the place of Ilara's laughing. On occasion, however, when the sun sets and the air becomes silent, we catch what seems like the tiniest sound of laughter. A spectral echo from a bygone era, a haunting reminder of the girl whose infectious giggles once reverberated throughout the home until a terrible tragedy tragically muted her voice. Story 24. I had an old neighbor named Mrs. Abernathy at 222 Ocean Avenue in Carmel by the Sea, California, and she was very routine-oriented. With a watering can in hand, she would go out of her charming home at 7:15 a.m. every morning to care for her beloved rose plants. At precisely 3 o'clock in the afternoon, she would relax on her porch swing, enjoying the ocean air with a cup of tea and a book. At 9 o'clock every night, she would watch the sun go down through the window lit by her bedroom light. I was quite perceptive, therefore, when Mrs. Abernathy's habits suddenly vanished. The porch swing was still, the rose plants withered, and the light from the window stayed out. It seemed like she had just gone. No one had seen her, no matter how many times I asked throughout the neighborhood. Even though she had parked her vehicle in the driveway, her mailbox was overflowing with letters. She seemed to have disappeared for an instant and never been seen again. I went to the police, but they were unconcerned, thinking she could have gone on an impulsive trip to see relatives or had a senior moment. Still, Mrs. Abernathy was someone I was familiar with. She would never abandon her cherished rose plants, even if she was far from family. There was a problem. After then, the most disturbing part started. In my own home, I began to discover items that belonged to Mrs. Abernathy. Initially, it was just little things. Someone forgot to take their trowel off my porch. My kitchen counter has a teacup. Perched on my nightstand is a book. At first, I tried to explain them away by saying that they were just a result of my constantly racing thoughts. However, the objects started to seem increasingly intimate and unsettling. On my mantel was a framed portrait of Mrs. Abernathy in her youth. On the back of my beloved recliner appeared a hand-knitted shawl that she often wore. Her false teeth eventually ended up in my bathroom sink, which was the most disturbing part. My heart sank. I had no idea how Mrs. Abernathy's stuff had gotten into my home. Even when she wasn't physically there, her influence seemed to permeate my existence and make me feel like she was trespassing. I was startled awake one night by an ominous sound emanating from my basement. With my pulse racing, I silently made my way downstairs, flashlight in hand. Mildew and dust filled the dank, wet air of the cellar. In an effort to pinpoint where the sound was coming from, I directed my spotlight toward the corners. Suddenly, I saw it. Hidden behind the staircase is a little wooden crate. I knew that was a chest. Mrs. Abernathy was the owner. A few months ago, while assisting her with retrieving some Christmas decorations from her attic, I had seen it. Opened the chest I did. A human skull lay within, surrounded by old photos and yellowed writing. I threw down the chest and staggered back in shock as I let out a scream. The cranium belonged to Mrs. Abernathy. The cops were notified. According to their findings, an apparently ordinary guy who lived next door to Mrs. Abernathy and had a hidden obsession with her killed her. In an attempt to cover up his heinous act, he murdered her, severed her body parts, and scattered her remains across the area. As a last sick act of brutality, he had buried her corpse in her own chest and stashed it in my basement. He did this to mock the authorities and jog Mrs. Abernathy's memory. The unexplained happenings in my home came to an end once the body of Mrs. Abernathy was found, and the truth was finally known. She was finally able to let her spirit go. However, in the recesses of my mind, I can't shake the recollection of her vanishing presence, a terrifying reminder that even the most picture-perfect towns may conceal evil. Even in the dead of night, I can sometimes nearly feel her presence, a soothing, reassuring presence that reminds me that there is hope and serenity to be found no matter how dark things seem.